All right, we're going to get started, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us this morning for our fourth day of Tipping Point, Connecticut's first affordable housing series. My name is Kylie Goslin. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Strong Communities. And throughout the week, the partnership will be hosting more than 30 sessions featuring local, state, and national experts leading conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues here in Connecticut. You can join the conversation about Tipping Point on Twitter at #TippingPoint2020 and follow us at PSC Housing. This session is our keynote session. This morning, we're so excited to welcome Diane Yentel, President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Before we do that, however, I'm just going to run through some housekeeping and thank our sponsors. First and foremost, thank you always to the Melville Charitable Trust, one of our leading sponsors, as well as the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. Their deep support has allowed this conference series to exist. And thank you also to our collaborating sponsor, the Connecticut Department of Housing, and to our supporting sponsors, Housing Enterprises, Inc. and Whittlesey. A few housekeeping items. This is a webinar format, so you will be muted throughout the session, and we also can't see you. So if you have a question for the Q&A session at the end of Diane's presentation, I'd invite you to please put that in the Q&A icon function at the bottom, not the chat. If you have technical issues, please put those in the chat window. So if you have any technology problems throughout this, just put a note in the chat and we'll do our best to help you resolve that as we move forward. I'll note that the session is being recorded, and we're going to make all recordings available of all the sessions on our website, pschousing.org, as soon as possible. Let's see. I think with that, I will just let you know that there's a poll that will pop up at the end of the session. We invite you to provide feedback, if possible, about the session. This helps us create better and the best webinars and conference offerings moving forward. And then also in the chat window, we'll be posting a link later in the session about a survey that the partnership is sending out on behalf of our Home Connecticut campaign, which is going through a restructure. So we're really curious to hear your feedback about affordable housing advocacy in the state moving forward. So if you wouldn't mind taking 5 minutes, and we have designed it just to be a 5-minute survey, we'd really greatly appreciate hearing your feedback on that, and feel free to forward that to others as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Many of you are familiar with her name. Diane is the president and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. She has over 2 decades of experience in affordable housing and community development policy. Before the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, Diane was the VP of Public Policy and Government Affairs at Enterprise Community Partners. And prior to Enterprise, she was the Director of Public Housing Management and Occupancy at HUD. She has a lengthy resume with a lot of other great experience in there. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Diane, because I cannot wait to see what she has in store for us today. So Diane, thanks so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you here in Connecticut virtually.
Great. Thanks, Kylie. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Appreciate everybody who's been able to join. And I do have some slides that we could please bring up. And I would just say I appreciate the opportunity to be here at this time, especially given what a truly consequential time it is, a time when it's very clear that if Congress and the White House don't act, and act soon, that we will be facing a housing crisis in our country unlike any I've ever seen in my lifetime. Kylie, are we able to bring up the slides?
Yep, I'm doing that right now.
Okay.
One moment to get these in presentation view.
Sure.
Sorry for this. Okay.
There we go. Great. Okay, and we can go ahead to the first slide, please. So to really understand the eviction crisis that we're facing today in our country, we have to recognize where we were even before COVID-19 came to our country. And that was in the midst of a severe affordable housing crisis, where we had a shortage of 7 million apartments affordable and available to the lowest income people. So another way of saying that same number is for every 100 of the lowest income renters, there were fewer than 40 apartments that were affordable and available to them. And you can see from this map that the shortage ranged from most severe to least severe, but there is no state that has a sufficient number of homes affordable for its lowest income renters. So because we had such a shortage of homes for those lowest income renters, we had nearly 10 million of the lowest income renter households, so about 25 million people in those households, that were paying at least half of their income towards rent. And many were paying much more, 60, 70, 80% of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. So when you have such limited income to begin with, and you're paying so much of it for your home, you're always one financial shock away from missing rent and facing possible eviction, and in worst cases, homelessness. Next slide, please. So for many of these same renters, the coronavirus is that financial shock. Can I have the next slide, please?
Sorry, Dan, I'm just having a challenge advancing slides.
Oh.
One moment, I apologize, folks.
Okay, no problem.
Kylie, if you're having trouble, I can take over sharing if yours is frozen.
All right.
Just give me a high sign here.
Yep, go ahead. Sorry, Diane.
Okay, no problem. Great, thank you. So, so when you have such limited income to begin with, you're always one financial shock away from potentially facing homelessness. And for many of these same renters, these 10 million renter households, the coronavirus is that financial shock, right? They've lost jobs, they've lost hours at work, they've lost wages, and it's harder than ever for them to cobble together what they need to make rent. Next slide, please. So if we had a system in our country to catch people when they fall off of a financial cliff, a cliff of any type, but especially one like the one related to COVID-19, if we had such a social safety net in place, we could better weather these challenges. But of course we don't. We have a housing system in our country where just 1 in every 4 households who needs housing assistance receives any. So 75% of people who need housing assistance and are eligible don't receive any housing assistance. They're the folks who wait in line to add their names to years, sometimes decades-long waiting lists, hoping to win what is essentially a housing lottery system, where only the lucky 25% get the help that they need. So now, because we have such gaping holes in our social safety net, we're faced with these tremendously challenging scenarios, like what happens when people sleeping in encampments without access to hot water or soap face a pandemic? Or what happens when our collective health depends on our ability to stay home and tens of millions of people are on the cusp of losing theirs? Next slide. And what happens when decades of structural racism collide with a deadly pandemic? So the current crises have heightened the threat of eviction for Black and Latino renters, but that threat is certainly not new. Decades of racist housing policies, from restrictive covenants and redlining and blockbusting to restrictive zoning today, purposefully put homeownership out of reach for many Black Americans. This created this yawning generational wealth gap, where today the average white family holds 8 to 12 times as much wealth as the average Black family. So this creates tremendous racial disparities in housing and homelessness. Structural racism leaves people of color disproportionately likely to be renters, disproportionately low income, disproportionately rent burdened, and disproportionately likely to experience homelessness. Now, these inequities are compounding the harm done by COVID-19. So Black and Native Americans are bearing the brunt of infections and fatalities, and Black and Latino people are bearing the brunt of these historic job losses. And now their homes, and with it, their ability to keep themselves and their families safe and healthy, are at risk. So these facts, this truth, heightens the urgency for action, both one, to make sure that we prevent a wave of evictions that will be predominantly people of color, Black and Latino renters. And it really makes clear our obligation to center racial equity in our response to the housing needs of COVID-19. So we have to ensure that not only we're not worsening or reinforcing racial inequities, but that we're using these tens of billions of dollars that are coming into communities today to reverse and to correct these disparities. Next slide. So the solutions to all of this are pretty simple, even if they're not easy, right? We have to protect and house people who are homeless today. We have to prevent more people from becoming homeless, and we have to center racial equity in the response. Next slide. So the CARES Act was a good start. Many of you here today and others across the country joined in our advocacy, and together with some congressional champions, we were able to achieve $12 billion in housing and homelessness funds and a partial eviction moratorium in that CARES Act that passed in late March. And these and other resources that were in the CARES Act, like expanded unemployment insurance and stimulus checks, and together with a patchwork of state and local eviction moratoriums, kept many people housed during these early months of the pandemic. Next slide. So now many of those resources and those protections are gone. The patchwork of state and local eviction moratoriums have mostly expired. There is a federal eviction moratorium in place, the CDC Eviction Moratorium. It's flawed, but generally speaking, it's keeping people housed, but it expires on December 31st. And in the meantime, renters are accruing tens of billions of dollars in rent arrears and late fees. Estimates range from anywhere from $25 billion to $70 billion will be owed in back rent by the end of the year. Clearly, this is far more than low-income renters can possibly pay off. Next slide. So there is some limited assistance available. Many communities used CARES Act and other funds to create emergency rental assistance programs. We're tracking all of the emergency rental assistance programs that have been created across the country. At last count, actually I have to update the slide because I think we're up to about 480 emergency rental assistance programs that we are tracking, including those in Connecticut. And certainly there's a lot of diversity in these programs. There's many differences in who they serve and how they operate and how successful they are operating, and a lot of lessons to be learned there. But the one overarching problem for all of these emergency rental assistance programs is limited resources. About 35% of these programs have already shut down despite growing need. And some of them had to shut down within hours or days as demand overwhelms any available resources. Next slide. So much more is needed. You know, the good news about this eviction crisis is that it's not only entirely predictable, as many of us have been predicting it for 9 months, it's also completely preventable. And the solutions too are pretty simple, even if they're not easy. We need the federal government to implement a uniform national moratorium on all evictions for non-payment of rent. You know, the very least that the federal government and really governments at all levels ought to do in the middle of a public health emergency is assure each of us that we're not going to lose our homes in the middle of it. But eviction moratoriums on their own aren't enough, because eventually they do expire and they create a cliff for renters to fall off of when back rent is due and they're no more able to pay it then than they are now, or they were at the beginning of the pandemic. So we need at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance to keep those low-income renters stably housed during the pandemic, and to make sure that small landlords have the rental income they need to keep paying their bills, keep the lights on, continue operating those properties. And we need another $11.5 billion in grants to homeless shelter and service providers to keep people who are experiencing homelessness safe and healthy, and to get them housed as quickly as possible. And together, these solutions would stem the tide of evictions. Next slide. So that's the good news. The solutions are simple. The bad news is that enacting these solutions, preventing this crisis, requires Congress and the White House to agree on something and to act. And unfortunately, at this point, I think that is very unlikely for months. You know, the solutions that I just named, they have passed the US House of Representatives at this point, not just once, not just twice, they've passed 3 times. There are multiple bills in the Senate to do the same. There's nearly unanimous Democratic support for these solutions. There's growing Republican support for them as well. And, you know, thanks to the advocacy of people across the country in our campaign for Rent Relief Now, in those final days of negotiations just a couple weeks ago, when Secretary Mnuchin and Speaker Pelosi were working on the details of a compromise bill, our solutions were on the table. Emergency rental assistance was part of those negotiations, and they were not very far apart in the numbers, in the amount, or even in the specifics. But the problem is getting to a larger deal. And despite the possibility of a compromise on assistance for renters and people experiencing homelessness, it looks very unlikely that there will be an agreement, at least in the next few months, on a bigger package. It's possible. Mitch McConnell has opened up the door and said he would like to get a COVID relief bill package passed this year. And so we are going to push for it. In fact, today we're doing a national call-in day, and I urge all of you to call your delegation and urge and really demand action on these issues before the end of the year. Because right now we are looking at the very real possibility of no emergency rental assistance provided by the time the CDC Eviction Moratorium expires on December 31st. And at that point, we are facing the possibility of tens of millions of people losing their homes in the dead of winter and during a peak COVID surge, which would be catastrophic for families, for children, for communities, and certainly for our country's ability to contain the pandemic. Next slide. So we can't accept that as an outcome. We cannot allow it to happen. So there's a few things that all of us can do in the meantime. One is to get the word out about the CDC Eviction Moratorium. There is a federal eviction moratorium in effect right now until December 31st. And as I said earlier, it's flawed. There are holes in it that renters are falling through, but many, many renters are staying housed because of the moratorium. But it only works when renters know about the protection and know what they need to do in order to receive it, which is to sign a declarative statement. So we have on our website a fact sheet. We have the declarative statement that we have translated into 14 languages, and I encourage you all to get those resources and circulate them in your communities so that renters stay housed now. The next thing we are urging everybody to do is, governors and mayors should not wait for the federal government to act to protect renters in their states and in their cities. So we are urging governors and mayors to re-implement or extend state or citywide eviction moratoriums. And in the last month, we had 2 governors, one in North Carolina and one in Colorado, do just that. Their eviction moratoriums had expired several months ago, and they put in place new eviction moratoriums. That's going to be essential to keep people housed if the CDC eviction moratorium expires. We're urging everybody to spend all available resources on emergency rental assistance. Incredibly, there are some communities that still have funds available that are not spent yet. Other communities, like in Connecticut, are having difficulty spending some of the money that they have set aside for emergency rental assistance. So we would urge you to do what you can to get that money out as quickly as possible and to target those resources, which will always be limited, to those with the greatest and the clearest needs, those who are most at risk of eviction, which is the lowest income renters. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we have to keep pushing Congress to enact real solutions. We can't accept from them or from ourselves anything but success here, because the consequences of failure are just too grave. And the stakes could not be higher right now. It's very clear that without a significant federal intervention, there will be a wave of evictions and displacement in the coming months. And in fact, the wave has already begun, and we need to act to prevent it from becoming a tsunami. And we are just about out of time. And ensuring that everybody is stably housed during the COVID-19 pandemic, it's not only a moral imperative, but it is a public health necessity. And then we have to go farther. We have to address the underlying shortage of affordable homes for the lowest income people. Unless, as a country, we're willing to make the kind of substantial investments needed in long-term solutions, then we'll face this eviction and homelessness crisis again during the next pandemic, or the next wave of this pandemic, or even just during the next year, because we still will not have solved for the underlying shortage of homes affordable to the lowest income people. And there too, we have solutions, we have resources as a country, certainly. The only thing we lack is the political will to fund those solutions at the scale necessary to end homelessness and housing poverty once and for all. And the one bit of hope there that I can then inject into this pretty bleak outlook is that President-elect Biden has a ambitious and potentially transformative housing plan. His housing plan frames providing resources within a frame of housing as a human right. And he proposes making Section 8 vouchers an entitlement available to anybody who needs and is eligible for them. He proposes tens of billions of dollars in resources to end homelessness and end housing poverty once and for all. And we'll certainly have our work cut out for us to actually achieve those commitments and those promises, but it is a sea change to have a president who is willing to be so ambitious in what he pushes forward for housing solutions. So we will look forward to working with him and his team to get that done, and to continue looking forward to working with all of you. And I just want to, before I just end and say thank you for the opportunity to be here today, I really want to thank you all for the tremendous work that you have been doing over the last year, the extraordinary and extraordinarily difficult work to keep people experiencing homelessness safe and healthy, to keep people from being evicted. You know, you are working day in and day out on some of the most pressing needs in some of the most challenging circumstances. And I'm grateful for your work, and I'm grateful for your advocacy now and in the days and weeks and years to come, because it's never been more important. So thanks so much, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane. That was really helpful and very informative. Couple questions we'll kick off, and then I have some others for that might spark some more conversation. But this one comes from Hiram. Hi, Hiram. In order to gain at least some support, or at least not have opposition from landlords and banks for the moratorium, how do we keep property owners whole, or at least mostly whole in the meantime? And I'll note too that our research here in Connecticut shows that the majority of our rental stock, or about half of our rental stock, I should say, is in 2 to 9 unit buildings, and we have, you know, more than 60,000 units occupied by owner occupied properties. So this is an issue that's been coming up continually, and the state is supporting particularly small rental property owners.
Yeah, I mean, we have been saying from the beginning that the emergency rental assistance is a win-win for low-income renters and for those small landlords. And absolutely, there's research recently, a survey that the Turner Center did that showed that about 50% of small landlords don't have access to credit. So they're not able to borrow the money that they need to make up for the lost rental income. And of course, it's the small landlords who are much more likely to be housing the lowest income renters who are struggling to pay the rent. So there's no doubt that small landlords are struggling, and the longer the moratoriums go on without rental assistance to accompany it, the greater the risk of small landlords losing their properties or walking away from their properties. And the last thing we want to do is end this crisis having saddled renters with more debt than they can possibly pay off in their lifetimes, or having lost any of our country's essential housing stock. So these are the many reasons why emergency rental assistance is so critically needed. And I will say that certainly at the national level, and I think at the local level too, that's a place where the housing groups from across the entire spectrum have been able to really come to consensus. So tenant rights organizations like the National Income Housing Coalition, to the National Apartment Association, National Association of Home Builders, the realtors, the whole full spectrum agrees and is pushing Congress to provide emergency rental assistance. And as I said, there actually is increasing support, certainly among the Democrats and among the Republicans too, to provide some type of resources to pay these rent arrears and to help with rent into the future. So we have to keep pushing.
Yeah, thank you. Great question from Alicia on any guidance on ensuring that these resources are effectively reaching people of color.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one I would say is that we at the National Income Housing Coalition joined with our national partners at National Alliance to End Homelessness, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Urban Institute, and a few other organizations to create what we've called a framework for an equitable homelessness response. And you can find those resources. I don't recall now the website name actually.
We can post a link, Diane. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, great. And that is really a toolkit and a roadmap for how to do exactly that. We are urging and encouraging everybody who is receiving these resources, whether it's the ESG CV dollars, the CDBG CV dollars, coronavirus relief funds, any funds that are going into communities, should be centering racial equity to meet the housing and homelessness needs of people of color. So please take a look at that roadmap, and there's a lot of suggestions in there, really concrete suggestions on how to do exactly that. I would say at the very highest and simplest level is that the more you target resources to extremely low income people and to people who are experiencing homelessness, the more you're centering racial equity. Because we know, as I shared earlier, because of this history of racist housing policies, that people of color are disproportionately those who are experiencing homelessness and those who are extremely low income renters. And a lot of communities, unfortunately, have an urge or a tendency to use resources to help higher income renters. And often it's because it's easier to serve higher income renters, but we should just be very clear that the higher up the income ladder you go for renters, the wider it gets. When and it is a racial equity and a racial justice issue to ensure that resources are serving those extremely low income people and people experiencing homelessness. Just in doing that, you are taking big steps towards centering racial equity and achieving racial justice.
Thank you. Any word from the CDC on news on extending the eviction moratorium past the December 31st?
No, nothing yet. We have been talking with people at the CDC and in HHS to urge them to do that. And I don't have yet any indication that they will. The CDC is unique in the administration. Of course, the director of the CDC is a political appointee, and so he is part of the Trump administration. And I think President Trump doesn't have any interest in extending the moratorium. But the CDC does also act independently from the administration sometimes. And so we are hoping that they will in this case, and we are really pushing them to extend it as soon as possible, not to wait until December 30th or December 31st to do it, and to improve it. There are flaws in the way the order was initially created, and then through an FAQ that the CDC put out, they really created more challenges for low-income renters. So we put together a set of recommendations for how they should improve it. And we are getting those same recommendations to President-elect Biden, because we are also urging him as one of his first hour emergency actions to sign an executive order and implement a new CDC eviction moratorium that's improved from the one today. So we will keep you posted if we hear more from the CDC on this.
Thanks, Diane. On that note, what are you hearing about implementation of the CDC moratorium? You noted there are holes in it. We found that here as well in Connecticut. Are there any states that are doing a good job of plugging those holes or doing a better job of communication? Any best practices out there on implementation of the CDC moratorium?
Yeah, I mean, there's some. So there's a few challenges with the CDC moratorium. One that I described earlier, in that it's not, automatic. Renters need to know that the moratorium exists, and they need to take an action. They need to sign a declarative statement. So that's the first challenge, is just getting the word out and making renters aware of the protection. The second challenge is that the order is written in some very important places. It's pretty vague, and it leaves too much space for judges and for courts to interpret the order much more narrowly than it's clearly intended to be interpreted. So there's a lot of variation in housing courts and in between states in terms of how the judges are interpreting the order. In some places, housing courts have essentially shut down until early January and said, we're not hearing any more eviction cases because there's a moratorium in effect. In other states, they are just churning through the eviction cases and putting people out of their homes. And then in many places, it's somewhere in between. The FAQ that was put out also created new challenges in stating, completely counter to the original order, saying that landlords and courts can take every step in the eviction process up to actually removing somebody from their home. That's really harmful. It has a chilling effect. A lot of renters will leave before the formal eviction process starts to avoid having that mark on their housing record for the future. And the other thing that the FAQ changed was to say that, again, counter to the original order, to say that landlords can question the truthfulness of the declarative statement in courts. That also has a chilling effect. People are already being very careful not to sign this. They're signing it under penalty of perjury. They're only signing it if it's true. The whole point of declarative statements is you're signing something to be true because it's difficult to prove that it's true. But now they're saying that you need to have all the proof. And so some people are just shying away. They don't want to sign it. They don't want to receive the protection because they're afraid of what landlords and judges might do to them. So these are some of the challenges. And then the question of enforcement is one of the biggest too, because there are actually very steep criminal penalties for landlords who wrongfully evict under this order, but there's nobody enforcing those penalties or enforcing the order. It should be the DOJ enforcing it, but they are not. We have tried to get the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, to take on an enforcement role. They've said that their interpretation of the order doesn't allow them to. But these are all the places where we are pointing out the flaws and working to correct them in any future iteration of the moratorium.
Thank you for that. Another question about state rent relief. So, as you know, we have a state rent relief program here in Connecticut, as you noted. While there's funding in it, $40 million, It's been slow to get the money out. There's been some efforts to streamline that. The concern here too is that that 40 million certainly isn't enough to meet the need. We estimate that to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. What other states have some programs that you would highlight? I know there's other states that put varying amounts into these. Are there some states that have allocated a lot of state resources or more federal resources, or are there other states that have been more effective in implementing these resources that you would highlight as good models?
Yeah, so as I said, we've been tracking all the emergency rental assistance programs. There's 480 of them at last count. We have a public-facing database of all the emergency rental assistance programs that we're tracking, and you can look at that and find the different funding resources and funding levels and whether or not those funds are being spent, and a little bit about the design of each of the programs. And then we just put out a report, I think it was last week or the week before, with some of our initial learnings and best practices and challenges that we're seeing among some of these rental assistance programs, and we'll continue to put those out. I would say that some programs stand out, and Connecticut is one of them, where it looks like there's a lot of challenges to getting the money out quickly, despite there being a tremendous need in the community. It's not that the need doesn't exist. It's that in some cases, there are several states where essentially, I think that the easiest way that I think about it is that states and program administrators have kind of overburdened themselves with complexity and with bureaucracy and with eligibility requirements. And that slows the whole thing down. So, there are some places where you have to have a 1-hour intake process and a, 10 to 50 page application for the funds. That slows things down dramatically, and it's not necessary. I understand why some communities feel that they need to have all of these eligibility or this documentation, because unfortunately HUD and Treasury were very slow to get guidance out. So it's not the fault necessarily of the local communities, but it's created these tremendous challenges. So the best practices, the places where we're seeing the money get out the quickest, is one, when they have income targeting. I'd say the quickest and the most effectively. There's deep income targeting to make sure the money's going to the lowest income people, and and that's essentially all the documentation that's required. So there are no other eligibility requirements added onto that. Even there are some places where cities or states have wanted to create requirements for landlords to meet in order for them to receive the funds. And again, they do it in a way that, they want to create new protections for renters. So if the landlord's going to get this money, they have to agree that they're not going to evict for some period of time, or they're not going to raise the rent. It's all with good intentions. But what we've seen is some landlords saying, well, I don't want to participate in that program. I'd rather just eat the lost rental cost and get a new tenant. And now that renter has not been helped. So I'd say simplicity is really the key to getting the money out as quickly as possible. And to your point, every community is struggling with limited resources. Mm-hmm. And so when there's a question of like first come, first served or lottery, we found that the lottery system is more equitable, because first come, first served, then you're getting those people who have better access to technology and often are higher income. They're less marginalized. If you give time for everybody to put in their applications and you do a lottery system instead, you're more likely to reach some of those highest need, most marginalized people.
And what are you seeing, or what are your thoughts on ensuring that landlords can apply for the programs versus tenants, or both? Are you seeing in some states, I know here in Connecticut, they just opened up the program that we have to allow landlords of a certain number of units, so smaller landlords, to apply for the funding. Is there similar programs in other parts of the country, or what are your thoughts on that component?
Yeah, most of them have the tenants apply and the money go to the landlord. So the tenants apply, but the check is actually written out to the landlord. And I do think that that's the best way to ensure that the money is being utilized in the way that best protects the tenant. But there are small landlords, certainly there are small landlords who need that money and are struggling. I think when the landlords themselves are the ones who are applying, there do need to be some additional protections to ensure that those funds are going to pay the back rent that's owed for that tenant, and that that tenant would be able to remain in that property for some period of time. So when it's a landlord-focused program, I think more protections are needed there. When it's the tenant-based program, I think fewer protections help get the money out faster. Not protections, but fewer documentation and eligibility.
Yeah, understood. A lot of what you just said rings true in terms of the challenges that we've had, and some of those barriers and documentations have come out over time. So that's good to hear. Question from Vintufo down in Stanford about HUD. And what authority does HUD have right now? And what are you seeing HUD do? Is there anything else HUD could be doing additionally to help with the rent relief or the eviction crisis that we're seeing?
Well, from the beginning, we believe, and lawyers that we've talked with agree, that HUD has the authority to implement its own eviction moratorium on directly HUD subsidized properties. HUD has disagreed, and their attorneys have said they believe that they don't have the authority to do that, and so they've declined to. And whether or not that's true, I think it's very clear that they have the authority to require directly HUD subsidized property owners to inform tenants of the CDC eviction moratorium. And there too, they have said no, and they've declined to do that. And in fact, in that FAQ that I mentioned earlier, that FAQ was put out by CDC, HHS, DOJ, and HUD. And it's notable from the HUD side, especially, that it says explicitly that landlords have no obligation to inform renters of the moratorium, which of course calls into question whether this administration is at all serious about making the moratorium work. And certainly HUD ought to be requiring, it's a very simple thing for property owners that are directly receiving a federal subsidy for their properties to inform tenants of the protection, but they've declined to do so. On rental assistance, there's really not a lot of room for them. One, certainly they could have got the money out more quickly. They should have gotten the guidance out much more quickly to allow communities to put those dollars to use faster. But HUD doesn't have the resources to meet the need that's out there. I mean, the scale and the scope of the need requires tens of billions of dollars, at least $100 billion in new federal resources. And HUD certainly doesn't have enough loose change around that they could scrape up to meet the existing need. And I would say at least HUD and this administration could be making the case to Congress for why this assistance is needed, and they have not. And not only have they not done that, but when there have been negotiations in Congress about an emergency rental assistance programs, and members of Congress have asked Secretary Carson, if you were to get this emergency rental assistance program, would your team be able to administer it and get the money out the door quickly? And Secretary Carson has said, no, we can't. I don't think we can do it. It would take us 6 or 7 months to be able to do it. So you shouldn't give us this program. You should give it to Treasury instead. This is what the Secretary of Housing has said. So HUD has done very little within the authority of what HUD can do. HUD has done very little to address the eviction crisis.
Yeah, frustrating, to say the least. Moving away from the COVID eviction crisis and rent relief programs, and you mentioned President-elect Biden's proposal to make Section 8 a sort of universal right, similar to SNAP is what I've heard, where, and this has been talked about for a while. There's been articles written. I know the partnership has published things about a national housing allowance or universal Section 8, basically, again, treating it like food stamps. If you're eligible, then this is a resource that you get. What's the, how realistic do you feel like that is at this point in time? For a long time, I feel like it had been treated as a pipe dream, but there's a lot more discussion of it now. And with the new incoming president-elect, what are your thoughts on the likelihood of that finding some traction and becoming a reality at some point within the next 4 years?
Well, so we have made tremendous progress in, I mean, we collectively throughout the country have made tremendous progress in elevating the affordable housing crisis and elevating the solutions in the national consciousness, and certainly among presidential candidates. And Joe Biden, he was the last to come up of all the 15 Democratic candidates for president. He was the last to put a housing plan forward. And when he did, one of the interesting things that was happening through that whole process was that each candidate, as they put out their plan, it was getting progressively more ambitious and more bold. And his plan, just recognizing it as what it is, it's really light years ahead of where the Democratic Party was just 4 years ago. And certainly 8 years ago. If you look at the plans that the major candidates put out, it was nothing like talking about housing as a human right and vouchers as an entitlement. So that alone is a tremendous accomplishment and a big step forward in having, the leader of the party who is in the White House talking about housing in that way. Actually achieving it now will be really challenging, and primarily because one of the outcomes of the election is that the Republicans are holding the majority in the Senate, and Mitch McConnell will continue to be the majority leader. And he has already been very clear about his intention to pretty much obstruct anything that this administration tries to do. So it's still going to be very challenging to actually achieve that commitment and that need. But I think there are ways to move towards it. So one, of course, having a president championing it and having a new HUD secretary championing and making the case for why it's needed is going to be really important. Also, right around this time last year, we worked through our Opportunity Starts at Home campaign to get bipartisan legislation introduced in the Senate that would create 500,000 new Section 8 vouchers, and they're called opportunity vouchers. So mostly for families with kids to move to neighborhoods with higher performing schools and so on. So 500,000 new vouchers would be significant, and there are multiple Republicans signed on to that bill. And so to the extent that we're able to get more vouchers, it's going to have to be a bipartisan effort. And we already have good legislation with Republican support that we can rally around. And that's where I think we can start to make some progress towards that goal.
Thanks. So in addition to additional vouchers or a universal Section 8, as of right, what are some of the other legislative priorities that you and the National Income Housing Coalition are looking towards, setting aside the immediate rent relief issue, which is a huge elephant, obviously, but there's other long-term issues in this space that, we're focused on, and I know you are too. What are some of the other things that you've sort of got in store, or things that you're already pushing for this coming, this new world we're in with President Biden?
New day. So we have a transition memo that I will share, maybe put in the chat box, that we've sent to the Biden's team, the transition team, that lays out our whole agenda and how we believe they can end homelessness and end housing poverty in the Biden administration. And it lays out all of our priorities, certainly the immediate needs of preventing evictions and paying back rent and helping people continue to pay rent through emergency rental assistance, but then all of the underlying structural issues that need to be resolved in order to actually end homelessness and housing poverty. So we need to make vouchers an entitlement and take steps up to there. We need big new investments in the National Housing Trust Fund in order to build apartments that are affordable to the lowest income people. We need a program that has emergency cash assistance to prevent eviction crises like the one that we're in right now, where people who can generally make ends meet have a financial shock, can get cash assistance to pay the rent and avoid all of the associated costs with eviction. So we lay out those priorities. And we need to preserve affordable housing and public housing. We lay out those priorities, and then we also make the case for how they can fit into some of what President-elect Biden has said will be his legislative package priorities. So for example, he wants to do something big on climate change. He wants to do something big on racial justice. He wants to do a big infrastructure / stimulus / build back better package. And for each of those, housing has to be a major component of them. And we make the case for why and how. And frankly, it's going to be easier for the Biden administration to make change through executive order and through regulation. So we also want to focus on fixing all that's been broken at HUD by this current administration. So, put back in place really strong fair housing regulations and go further and advance those. Put back in place protections for LGBTQ people experiencing homelessness, and builds back the morale and kind of the spirit of HUD, because really HUD as a building has been hollowed out in the last few years. Morale is very low, staffing is very low. So we would want to see the administration really put effort into building HUD back to be strong and powerful, and to advance through regulation policies that can really have a big impact at the local level.
Thanks for that. So we only have a couple minutes left. I know my partner Chelsea will put the survey in the chat that I mentioned earlier and launch the poll. But Diane, is there anything that you feel that folks in Connecticut could and should be doing moving forward? Obviously, we have a great congressional delegation that's been really supportive. But in addition to continuing to work with them and push them, what are some other things that folks can do? We have advocates, developers, I see planners in our participant list, so a wide array of folks here. How can we be helpful to advancing some of the things that you've talked about today?
I mean, I would just say, underscore some of the things that I've shared in that, there are many things you can do. One is to think about how at the state and local level you prevent this wave of evictions that is coming. Assume that the federal government is not going to act in time, and think about what you can do at the local level to protect people. So think about citywide eviction moratoriums, think about statewide eviction moratoriums, think about ways to improve and streamline the emergency rental assistance program so that those dollars can get out to the renters who need that money to be able to stay housed. Look for other resources that might be available through the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which, by the way, expires at the end of the year. Any money that hasn't been spent goes back to the federal government where it's not needed. It's needed at the local level. So spend it now if you still have unspent money. Target existing resources to the people who are most likely to be evicted if they don't have those resources. So really think about the most marginalized people. Think about immigrants. Think about people who don't speak English. Think about extremely low-income people who are experiencing homelessness. Think about ways that you in Connecticut have done tremendous work in deconcentrating shelters and getting people out of congregate shelters and into hotels. Think about how you turn that into permanent housing opportunities. The last thing we want to do is have people who are in hotels now have to go back to the sidewalk they were sleeping on before COVID-19 came. That's an unacceptable outcome. And continue to call your members of Congress. Whether or not they are already champions, they still need to hear from you, and they still need to be held accountable, because as you know, they have many, many, many urgent priorities. And when push comes to shove and there's a chance to pick 3, housing has to be one of those. And we can't assume that some of our longtime allies will always have housing as one of those top 3. So keep pushing them and keep holding them accountable as well.
Thank you, Diane. We so appreciate you joining us here today and being a part of Tipping Point and being a part of our work here in Connecticut. Please keep up the great work. We look forward to hopefully continuing to see your face around DC and interacting more with the coalition in the years ahead. We're excited about the possibilities. As you noted, we've got a lot of work to do over the next few months. So thanks so much again. We really appreciate your time today. Thanks to all of you for participating in this session. In the chat window, you'll see a link to our next session, which is about the intersection of housing and education, which I encourage you to join. And you'll see that poll that just popped up as well. So thanks again. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, everyone.